Hey guys, Henry here. Today my family and I are making beef Wellington. For this recipe we'll need olive oil, a pound of mushrooms, 2 shallots, 3 cloves of garlic, a few chestnuts, a few sprigs of fresh thyme, not pictured here for some reason, a good amount of salt, a Chateaubriand or the center cut of beef tenderloin, pepper, Dijon mustard, prosciutto, a cup of all-purpose flour, 3 eggs. I put 2 here, but that's because I didn't realize my dad and sister were going to make 2 batches of crepes. 1 1/3 cups plus a tablespoon of milk, 4 tablespoons of unsalted butter, and puff pastry. I didn't include these ingredients because I didn't originally intend on making it, but to make our red wine sauce, we're going to need 2/3 of a cup of red wine, about a tablespoon of powdered au jus, a tablespoon of flour, and a small spoonful of brown sugar. The first element of a beef Wellington that we need to make is a Duxelle. To do this, we're going to mince 1 pound of mixed mushrooms. You can have any combination of mushrooms, but I chose to have 8 ounces of baby bella mushrooms, 4 ounces of shiitake mushrooms, and 4 ounces of king oyster mushrooms. I didn't get footage of it, but my dad and I also chopped a few mushrooms in the background. That's gonna take a while, so in the meantime, my dad and sister are gonna make savory crepes. To do this, they're gonna add 1 1/3 cups of milk, a cup of flour, 3 eggs, and 2 tablespoons of melted butter to a blender. Next, they're gonna cook the crepe. This is a very unique process. With a normal pancake type thing, you just have to pour the batter in the pan. However, with crepes, you have to tilt the pan as you're pouring the batter to spread it around. Then, once it's done cooking on one side, you have to lift up the edge with your fingers and flip it. Most people use a spatula for this part, but my dad uses a small wooden utensil he calls the crepe paddle. Sorry if that explanation went on a little long, I just wanted to share something I find fun and interesting. After about 45 minutes, the mushrooms were fully chopped, so we transferred those to a bowl. Next, my mom chopped up 3 cloves of garlic and 2 shallots, utilizing the damp rag technique my sister taught me. It didn't work as well this time, so I stepped in while my mom's eyes took a break. This went well.
Get away from my eyes. Ow! Ah!
After about 20 minutes of eyeball torture, the shallots were fully minced, so we threw them in a bowl with the garlic. We were gonna add the chestnuts, but as it turned out, they had fully rotted. Like when we opened them, green dust came out. And it's not even because we left them out or whatever, we had bought them that day. Anyway, here's a quick shot of the product of our work. Next, we're gonna cook our Duxelle. To a pan on medium-high heat, I threw in my minced shallots and garlic and drizzled it with a few tablespoons of olive oil. Then I sweated them until they started to become translucent. This is just kind of a random thought, but I want everyone here to take a few moments to appreciate the beautiful, bright, shiny pink color of the shallots. I love it. Anyway, the shallots and garlic finished cooking, so I added all of my mushrooms and a very generous pinch of salt. One thing about beef Wellington that gives it its bold flavor is the heavy amount of salt that everything gets. After a while, the Duxelle started browning nicely and released most of its water, so I added a few sprigs of thyme to give it a nice herbal base and remove it from heat. Next, we have to sear and season the beef. Quick warning, this might be very unappetizing or upsetting to some people. If you don't want to see raw beef, skip to the time code on the screen. I unwrapped my beef and cut all the butcher's twine. As it turns out, the twine had imprinted lines all around the beef, so I tried to smooth it out by rolling it with saran wrap. It didn't really work, but it did something. After that, I patted my beef dry using a paper towel. I then seasoned it very generously with salt and pepper on all sides. I think next year when I make this, I'm gonna add a few more spices to it, since I have a lot of steak spices I think would go really well with Wellington. To a pan on medium-high heat, I added a few tablespoons of olive oil and my beef. I then seared it on all sides. The reason the pan is on such high heat is because we're not trying to cook the inside of the beef yet, since we're gonna bake the Wellington later on. After all the sides had a nice tan, I transferred it to a separate plate. I think the sear turned out really nicely. The next step is probably the most difficult, the first step of assembly. I laid out 2 crepes so that they would just overlap and started putting prosciutto on. This part was more difficult than I remember since the prosciutto slices were torn for whatever reason. It ended up being more of a mass of prosciutto rather than a layer. Next, I spread all of my Duxelle over the prosciutto so that it would just cover the beef when we rolled it. I was a little worried that it wouldn't be enough since there wasn't a lot of Duxelle, but when I rolled the Wellington up, it barely fully covered the beef. I had a hard time closing the sides of the crepe since it was a tiny bit too small, but after a few attempts at utilizing saran wrap to seal it, my dad and I managed to fully close the crepe. It was only after the Wellington had fully assembled that I realized that I forgot to brush the beef with Dijon mustard, which was a little disappointing. I named my Wellington Arthur for reasons that I'll talk about during the history segment and brought it upstairs to the fridge. Normally, beef Wellington only rests for 20 to 30 minutes, but it was 10:30 p.m. by the time I finished the assembly, so I decided to pull an Alvin Joe and continue in the morning. While we wait, let's talk about beef Wellington. Beef Wellington is one of my favorite foods of all time, second only to blanquette de veau. It's made with the center cut of tenderloin wrapped in a Duxelle, which is a cooked mixture of mushrooms, shallots, and garlic, prosciutto, crepes, and a puff pastry. The recipe I used in this video is kind of a combination of a lot of other recipes. Gordon Ramsay gave me the idea for the chestnuts, even though I didn't use them. Well Plated made the crepe recipe, Baker Betty made the egg wash, Alvin Joe made the wine sauce, and everything else about the Wellington was made by Joshua Weissman, so huge thank you to everyone. The links to all the videos and websites are in the description. First time I made this was for my first ever cooking video, titled simply Cooking with Insanity. In the video, I didn't even use the correct cut of beef, and it still turned out kind of okay. Also, fun fact, beef Wellington is Gordon Ramsay's signature dish. Very popular theory about beef Wellington's origin is that it was created in celebration of the first Duke of Wellington, Arthur Wellesley's victory against Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. There's debate over why it was named beef Wellington. My guess would be that it's named after Wellesley's title, but some people think that it's because it resembles a Wellington boot. Despite this theory, the true origin lies in France. Apologies in advance for the pronunciation, but beef Wellington Wellington was originally named Filet de Boeuf en Croûte, which literally translates to crusted beef fillet. The first recipe for Beef Wellington was written in 1940 from a cookbook written by a chef from the Palmer House Hotel in Chicago, which is also where brownies were invented. Anyway, let's get back to cooking. The next day, before I continued on the Wellington, I realized that I had the ingredients to make the wine sauce that Alvin Joe makes in his video, so I decided to give it a shot. To a pot over medium heat, I added about 2/3 of a cup of red wine and a little under a tablespoon of au jus powder. By the way, sorry about my cardinal sin of putting a dry ingredient in the liquid measuring cup. I originally intended to add water to the au jus, but my dad suggested using just the powder so that it would reduce faster. I then left the wine on heat so that it would reduce while I was making the Wellington. Meanwhile, I removed my Beef Wellington from the fridge and revoked its name. Then floured my soap pat with an absurd amount of flour. I placed down my puff pastry and rolled it out until it was what I deemed to be the correct size, using expert techniques to ensure even thickness.
This is probably the correct way to use a rolling pin.
My dad pointed out that the flour had made a layer on the puff pastry, so we wiped some of it off, which somehow worked. I then whisked together 1 egg and 1 tablespoon of milk to create an egg wash. This is going to make our puff pastry very shiny and crunchy on the outside. I then brushed it over the puff pastry, which was very fun. Then I placed my Wellington at the edge of the puff pastry and rolled it until the pastry connected. I cut off the excess, pinched together the edges, and brushed it with more egg wash. Next, I used a lattice roller to make a very nice pattern on my puff pastry. I then cut off the excess. When I tried to spread out the pattern, I realized that the lattice roller hadn't cut all the way through, so I tried to use a butter knife to cut the rest of the way, which I decided took too long. So my dad and I tried to use the lattice roller again by lining it up with the cuts. This worked pretty well, though it was slightly misaligned, so a part of the pattern fell apart. I forgot to move the camera, so you can't really see it, but we then applied the lattice. I brushed it with egg wash and sprinkled it all over with a lot of salt, then placed it in the oven. That's gonna bake for almost an hour, so in the meantime, I'm gonna finish my wine sauce. To a small dish, I added 2 tablespoons of butter and softened it. Next, I added a tablespoon of flour and mixed it up into a paste. I added all of the paste to the sauce, stirred it up, and added a small spoonful of brown sugar to give it a lighter, slightly sweeter tone. After almost an hour, I removed my Wellington from the oven to find that the puff pastry had cooked beautifully. Don't mind all of the stuff on the pan. I poked it with a thermometer while it was in the oven and a bunch of juice came seeping out. I cut into the Beef Wellington to find this beautiful cross-section. Oh, nope, the beef fell out of the Wellington. Either way, here's what the cross-section actually looks like. I'm very proud of how this Wellington looks. It has a nice golden brown shiny exterior and a beautifully rich red interior. My only real complaint, apart from the fact that the puff pastry and the interior are too separate, is that the Duxelle is a little too light. Also, montage. Finally, it was time to taste the Beef Wellington. I cut off a piece and...
Oh my god. That is so good. I would call this a success for sure.
It was fantastic. The beef was cooked perfectly and was seasoned well. The Duxelle had a very rich flavor and complemented the beef nicely. The prosciutto added a very nice light balance to the whole thing, and the puff pastry was crunchy and delicious. However, no dish is without flaws, and this is no different. I wish I had added the mustard, as I think it would have helped to balance the flavors. I wish I had added more salt to the Duxelle, as I think the flavors were too dark in the end. And I wish that the structure was more well set. Overall, though, I think Beef Wellington continues to retain its spot as my second favorite food. Anyway, if you enjoyed this video, please make sure you hit the like button and subscribe. It means a lot and helps me do these kinds of projects in the future. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video. Bye.